So here are some tips. If you are doing the question that's got the two opposing viewpoints in the short answer question, the two secondary sources that you're comparing, in your answer, you have got to answer the question. First sentence that you have would identify where the authors are different. And then your second sentence, your evidence for that question, and you'll see what I mean in just a second, is going to summarize the main idea of each author. And so you've got to make sure that you have to show how this relates to the author, right? So, so for A, you're telling how they're different. And then B and C, you're giving examples that relate to each author. And you'll see that sample in just a second. When you're looking at an image, once again, make sure that you are very, very squarely answering the question and tying it to the image. If you look back at your answer to the SAQ and you've not made any reference to the image itself, you've probably not answered the question. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a second. And then same thing when you're looking at the point of view, an example that we either support the point of view of the artist or refute the point of view of the artist, you've got to tie it back in to what's being shown in the image. So these are the two samples that we will be looking at here on my document camera. I took these from AP Classroom, and these are former questions that have been used on the AP exam. So as I've done on previous videos, we are going to use the document camera, and I've come up with a sample answer that I've made up. You can certainly have different answers, but I want to show you how I've set up the answer. All right, so here's the first question. You've got this passage from Josephson, and you have a passage from H.W. Brands. And the questions, look what they're asking us to do. Briefly explain one major difference between Josephson and Brands' historical interpretations of business leaders who rose to prominence in 1865 to 1900. So this is the time period that we're discussing today, the Gilded Age. And how did these business leaders, when they came to power, the difference, we're looking at what the two authors have to say about them. And we'll read it in just a second. Then the next question, give an example of a person, an event, or a development. And this needs to be very specific. You want a specific example from the time period that was not mentioned in the excerpt that could support Josephson's interpretation. And then the third one, describe, same thing, person, event, or development from the period that would support Brands. So here we've got Brands, here we have Josephson, and we've got to figure out how they're different. So let's look at the passage. Let's start with Josephson. They were aggressive men, as were the first feudal barons. Sometimes they were lawless in important crises. Nearly all of them tended to act without those established moral principles, which fixed more or less the conduct of the common people of the community. So basically, they're acting in a way that he's saying is immoral, and that's not common for the common man. These men were robber barons, as were their medieval counterparts, the dominating figures of an aggressive economic age. Under their hands, the renovation of our economic life proceeded relentlessly. Large-scale production replaced the scattered, decentralized mode of production. Industrial enterprises became more concentrated, more efficient technically, and essentially cooperative, where they had been purely individualistic and lamentably wasteful. So he's saying, yes, maybe they've made things more efficient, but at what cost? They've done this in a way that is not moral and taking advantage of these commoners. Then H.W. Brands is saying what really lifted the giants above the rest was the ability to envision where the world, or their part of it, was going, and to act on that vision in a creative way. From the days of Adam Smith, so he was the economist, you may remember him from world history, self-interest has been the acknowledged driving force of capitalism. The secret of the market system is that one person's self-interest can simultaneously serve the interest of others. Buyers and sellers, producers and consumers, investors and entrepreneurs take reciprocal advantage of each other. Success rewards those who can discover or create areas of reciprocity. So if we have success on one side, he's saying that could create success for others. The larger the area, the greater the success. They were captains of industry, but like officers of volunteer regiments, they held their post at the sufferance of those that led. All right. So now we need to think about how they differ from one another. So I've come up with a sample answer. And so here I've got my College Board paper that you're going to, if you're doing this at school and not digitally, you're going to keep your answer in the box. Make sure that you label your answer. And I want us to think about how I am going about making sure that I'm answering the question. My first sentence needs to identify the topic on which they differ. Don't just go straight into saying the main idea of Josephson is this and the main idea of Brands is this, and that be your answer, because that's not explaining or identifying what they differ on. So look how I've done this. My first sentence, Josephson and Brands disagree on how big business leaders impacted the larger community. That's what I'm saying is different about them. Then my evidence for answer A, right? Go back to what the question asked. How do the two authors differ? Okay. And so I'm saying that they differ in how they view big business leaders impacting the community. Now I'm going to say what Josephson believes. Josephson views the business leaders in a negative light and as robber barons. And I need to explain that, who took advantage of the lower classes. Brands instead, and notice I'm saying instead here because this is something that he does differently, views the same business leaders in a positive light as captains of industry. And what does that mean? What does that mean that they're a captain of industry? They brought opportunity to consumers and workers by growing large companies. All right, so notice what I've done here. My first sentence, how are they different? I'm coming up with that topic. Then I've got what Josephson says and what Brands is saying. Then for question B, I was supposed to come up with an idea about how a piece of evidence that would support Josephson, showing that they were in a negative light. So I'm going to think back to some of those big businessmen that I studied in class, and I'm going to say that J.D. Rockefeller and his use of predatory pricing to build Standard Oil is an example that supports Josephson. So here I've got my answer. This is what I'm saying is my answer. That big business leaders negatively impacted the community. So J.D. Rockefeller and his use of predatory pricing. But I need to define what that is. What is predatory pricing? So now I'm going to explain it, okay? And so by undercutting smaller businesses with predatory pricing that was intended to force the small businesses to close, Rockefeller formed a monopoly and controlled the vast majority of the oil industry. Now I've got to tie this into how it aligns with what Josephson is saying. That's the key here that a lot of students don't do. You have your example, but then you don't bring it back to what Josephson is saying. How or why does this support Josephson? This hurt small businesses who couldn't compete and consumers who had to pay higher prices due to Standard Oil's monopoly, which aligns with Josephson's claim of aggressive and sometimes unfair actions. So I have proven that this example matches up with what Josephson has said. Now I need to do the same thing with an example for Brands. And so I'm going to think back to some of those big businesses that may have benefited the community. Andrew Carnegie's charity work to create libraries and support the arts in cities supports Brands' positive view of big business leaders. So I'm going to say Carnegie's charity work, which was what? He's going to support the art. He's going to make a lot of libraries. But I need to explain what that is. Okay, so I define it a little bit further. Carnegie's reinvestment of his wealth provided educational opportunities to those who might not have otherwise been able to access it. So this is how it's helping the community. Then I've got to tie it back to Brands. This charity work supports Brands' ideas about success, breeding more success, and serve the interest of everyone, right? So if we are providing education, then that's going to help everyone in the community. All right, so that's how you would use the two passage questions. Then the one that's the image question. So I hope that helps. Now, again, you can certainly go back and